I'm actually a little nervous. I think you are a very, very strong and interesting woman. So
Thank you very much. It is an absolute honor to be hearing such from you. From a very young age, I have always admired your humanitarian work and advocacy for human rights.
oh, thank you.
I think I'm going to jump off this call so you guys can actually have the conversation together. You guys enjoy. I'll be in the background. No worries.
So I'm so happy to separately from this, really, to meet you. And I think it's also personally because of being a mom and my daughter, and just a little bit I've learned about my daughter, who's from Ethiopia, and her relationship to her hair also has been an interesting journey and an understanding of herself and how important it is to her and to me. Through her. So I also personally was just know how meaningful it is, what you stand for and what you were saying. And I know it's not just about hair. I know it's about the bigger picture, of course, and all the bigger rights you're fighting for. But just on a personal, that moment, that fight was very moving.
Thank you very, very much. Thank you very much.
So you were very young. Can you tell me and anyone listening? So, because I think one of the things that's so nice is to, around the world, there's so much happening. There's so much inequality, injustice. There's so much that is happening with the climate, with displacement, brutality. It's overwhelming. And I think for a lot of young people, while they are also very active to fight and very conscious and inundated with information, it can also be very overwhelming. So how old were you when you started, maybe very young, but when you were aware, or what was it that you feel in your life made you more aware of inequality or activism?
Growing up for me, being born post 1994 in South Africa meant that I was defined as a born free, as a South African born after the apartheid regime. And one thing that I was always indoctrinated with, be it in the schooling environment or just by society around me, was the fact that I was born into a free country and a country free from inequality. And whenever I looked around at the social conditions that people had to live under, particularly Black African people, I did not see that reality of freedom being represented. And having gone to schools that were multiracial schools, which were historically were the former whites only schools, once they were desegregated after 1994, having gone to those schools since I began school, there was always a notion of multiculturalism that we were taught. And also we were always taught about the ideology of the rainbow nation and being united regardless of race, class, or creed. And when I looked at the reality and I looked at my surroundings, that was not the reality that was represented. What I saw was a society whereby we were divided by race, class, and creed, even in the schooling environment, whereby I remember from my earliest childhood moments, I remember going to schools whereby we were divided even on the playground, where the white children only played with the white children and Black children only played with Black children. And I remember being sensitized to the dynamics of the country that I lived in by my parents, having grown up in an interracial background whereby both my parents come from backgrounds whereby they've both been affected by colonialism and apartheid, but in different ways because of how multi-dimensional and how layered oppression is. Having an Indian father who is an immigrant and having a Black African mother, I was sensitized to to the fact that racism was not buried in 1994. And growing up, I remember from as early as I was 8 years old, I was sensitized to the fact that prior to our democracy in South Africa, there was an act called the Immorality Act, which was the act under the apartheid regime, which banned interracial marriages. And I was sensitized to that. And I remember from as early as 7, I was able to understand that I was treated differently, and people were treated differently on the basis of race and class in the society that I lived in. And so I remember from my early childhood, from about 7, 8, 9, I remember that I understood that racism was something that was still attached to South Africa, within our economy, and also within the way our society is built and constructed, and how resources are shared amongst the country. And I remember from when I was 9, I wanted to not just be part of seeking for change, but be part of propelling the country in a direction of change.
And how do your parents must be very interesting people, must be very strong. Do they speak to you about these things? Did you speak to them when you were 7, 8, and 9 and thinking about this and feeling this? Were there a lot of discussions in your household?
Interestingly, I grew up in a very political household. My father had played a role in South Africa's liberation struggle and was active in the late 70s, 80s, and especially in the late 80s when the country had gone under a state of emergency. And so growing up, I remember my dinner table discussions were very political. And I remember every single day having a discussion around what was taking place in the country. And so I grew up very socially aware of a lot of the things happening in the world. I remember when I was 8, we would speak about Palestine during the afternoon. My father and I would speak about Palestine. And I also started reading at a very early age, which also started to develop my mind into wanting to bring about change in society. I started reading at the age of 4. And when I started reading, my dad was very supportive of my love for literature, whereby every single day he made me fetch a newspaper for him and would actually make me read the front cover article to him. And I remember it started off with me just reading the headline to him. And as I got stronger in my reading, he'd actually make me read the whole article. And I'd have to do that before I would leave for school. And so I was also very inquisitive. So in my car rides on my way to school, I would always ask questions about what I had to read about in the newspaper. And I remember my dad being very supportive of me wanting to be part of propelling the country into a direction of change, because I remember whenever I was asked what I wanted to become, I always said that I wanted to become a lawyer, I wanted to become an advocate. And I do remember my father supporting that dream.
That's really such an important lesson for anybody who's a parent who's listening, because I think so often the parent thinks that, you know, at some point you will talk to your kids about politics and Palestine and racism. At some point they will have these discussions, and they don't realize that from 7 years old, they're listening to everything at the dinner table and what you're bringing to the house and whether they feel included in that conversation. I think it sounds like your father was already very aware that that it was valuable to you to understand all of your rights and issues happening around the world, and that he respected you and your mind to invest in time and grow that side of you. That really is wonderful. What a wonderful father.
Thank you very much.
So when you became more active when you were in high school? That was your first move.
Yes.
Is that now the the kind of the challenge to the system in school was that your first, the time, I'm sure it's not the last, the first time you kind of decided you would, you know, hold those accountable who were being ignorant, and that you would speak out? Was that the first time?
I believe it was. I believe it was. I interestingly was very shy growing up. So from the time I was 12, I never used to speak much publicly. I was just one of those kids whereby you could actually, if you were in a room with me, you could actually question whether or not I was present in that room. And I remember when I turned 12, I decided to cut my hair after having straightened hair for about 2.5 years, and that was because I, like many of my peers, had succumbed to the institutional culture in a lot of the institutions in South Africa that were your historically white institutions, which run on white culture and expect you to assimilate to white culture. And so I remember straightening my hair because I felt that I would be respected, and I felt that I would be more presentable. And as I turned 12, I decided that this is not who I actually am. This is an altered version of me. And if I'm going to walk into developing an identity for myself, I ought to express myself in my truest form. And so I decided to cut my hair and grow it out naturally. And I remember that also made me gain a lot of confidence, and it made me see a lot of worth in my own voice. And so I actually then began to actually speak up. And then when I got to high school, after 13 years of being made politically and socially aware of the conditions in the country, I got to high school and I was facing them in a much harsher perspective. I remember my first day at high school. I had my first experience of racism, whereby I was walking in a corridor with a friend and we were speaking in isiZulu, an African language. And I remember a white educator walking out of her office and storming up to the both of us, and she grabbed me by my wrist and scolded me and told me that I need to stop making inappropriate, uncivilized noises in the corridor, and I ought to only converse in English or Afrikaans because that's appropriate. And I remember I went home that day and I told my father about the incident, and he actually likened the incident to a lot of the experiences that a lot of people had faced under the apartheid regime. And I remember going, as more days passed in high school and the more experiences I had, I remember actually saying that it cannot be that I sit here in a democratic country where I'm told as a young person that I'm born into freedom and I'm born free, yet those are not the conditions that I'm subjected to. And I am experiencing a privatized and institutionalized form of apartheid, which lies in the policies and lies in the minds of people, which influences the interactions that they're having with me. And I'm being treated in an inferior light on the basis of skin and class. And so I remember speaking to a lot of fellow pupils at the time about the conditions, as conditions got more worse and they got harsher, and it began to become conditions where we were unable to breathe under these conditions, because we felt that we were in an institution whereby they were at war with our Blackness, and we were expected to leave our Blackness at gate and assimilate to whiteness upon entrance into the institution. And I remember in our conversations, we all had one common tone, where the common tone was we were all demanding for change, because we were not the first to encounter such. This was something which Black girls from 1994, upon the time when gates were opened up to all races, were experiencing such, and were silenced and were forced to be silenced about the conditions that lie behind the gates. And I remember saying that we can't just merely speak about demanding change and not do anything about seeking that change. And I remember we had a conversation in July whereby this was after we were told that afros, dreadlocks are not permitted on the premises of the institution. And if your hair is like that, you will not be allowed to write your examinations. And I remember we had a conversation in July about that. And we said that it cannot be that there is going to be hindrance that there's going to be hindrance to us obtaining a constitutional right, because education is a constitutional right in South Africa, and it cannot be that there's going to be something that is going to hinder that and stand in the way of us obtaining an education, which according to the Constitution, we are entitled to. And so I remember then we planned a silent demonstration for the 26th of August, 2016, whereby we planned to come dressed in all Black, which symbolized our resistance, and have placards, which whereby on the placards, we would have statements on what we were demanding to change. We had statements around the racist hair policy, which we demanded for it to be abolished, because we believed at the time that the existence of a hair policy allows room for discrimination, because you grant a minority of individuals you grant them the power over other people's identity and over how other people express their identity. And this minority of people always happens to be white women. And so we demanded that would be abolished, as well as the policy on language, which prohibited the speaking of African languages. And among other things, we also demanded accountability, as well as for the use of racial slurs such as the N-word and the K-word to be prohibited, because those were slurs which were freely passed and exchanged within the property. And so I remember on the day we arrived with our placards dressed in all Black, and the response that we received from the institution then led to a follow-up demonstration the following day. How the institution had responded was they had at the time hired more security for underage Black girls, and the security at the time was very harsh, and several people had experienced being manhandled by the security. And so the following day, we then decided to plan a march within the property, a silent march. And on that day, on the 27th of August, when we marched, we were met with a high-risk security team, a private high-risk security team, which was armed with guns and dogs. I remember that was the first time in my entire 13 years of existence I'd seen a gun in my life. And we were threatened with arrest if we did not disperse. And we at the time had refused to disperse, because we at the time knew that what we were demanding was not something that was not entitled to us. We were demanding something that was already written in the Constitution. And we knew that their practices were unlawful. And we knew that what we were demanding was not just for ourselves, but was for girls that would follow and would come after us and would walk the corridors of the institution after us. And we knew that we were not just demanding for accountability for ourselves, but for all those that had come before us and were silenced, and for all those in other parts of the country who were silenced at the time. And so we stood our ground, and I remember saying, "You can arrest us," and that then became a statement which was chanted by everyone who was protesting at the time. And after that, we then started a hashtag which gained over 100,000 tweets. And at that time, I realized how powerful the voices of young people when united are, how powerful our voices are when we are united. And we had a petition which we shared across social media, and the petition gained close to 29,000 signatures. And through that, we were then successful in changing the policy and having the racist hair policy suspended. And this also led for change in other parts of the country. And I then realized that young people are powerful when united. And I also then realized that it is imperative that young people are at the forefront of change across the world, because we are the ones that are going to inherit and occupy the future. And so it is only appropriate that the future is shaped and determined by us who are going to inherit it. Apologies, I think you are muted.
I'm muted. Really, I think of yours, it's so inspiring, because these are the moments, this is why, this is what makes a person, this is why we're alive, right? To find what matters, to connect as human beings, to know who we are, and to know when to stand for what we believe in, and to be with others who are also willing to stand up against what is wrong and unjust. And so I think of that, I hear your story and I think of those moments, and while I find it just unbelievably shocking and ignorant that would be the response, or that even had to be addressed at all, and how truly disturbing that is. I'm also smiling because that fight, that understanding, that way of approaching, and not just, I think what's interesting about what you're speaking of, and I hope people gather, and one of the reasons we wrote the book and worked on the book, all of us together, is that young people are the future. They are a voice. They are also a generation that is, because of social media and because of this different way of interacting, it is a generation more aware of issues and more aware of each other and more connected to each other than any generation before. And so the world you share, and this kind of living internationally and interconnected, is different. It's different than a lot of the people who are making the laws and decisions understand. And so it is an unusual generation that has to shape this new future, while also up against all of the damage and destruction from all the greed and the fear and the ignorance of the past. What I love about what you spoke of is not just the youth coming together, but also when you spoke about understanding the Constitution and understanding that education is in the Constitution. And I think it was one of the things we did talk about in the book, which is you have the youth who are on the right side, and the spirit and the will and the energy. If we can also make it possible for those to be more aware of their rights, the laws, how to question and learn about your own constitution wherever you're standing, to be able to then kind of beat them at their own game and be able to weigh it all. I think that's a really important message, and I think a lot of young activists are doing that, but something that those of us who want to support can do better at helping, I think. What are you working on now, or what is your focus now?
Currently I am in university and I am pursuing my degree, and my current short-term focus is to study towards becoming a lawyer, a human rights lawyer. And I'm also, this year, I published my first children's book titled My Coily Crowny Hair, which is currently a bestseller in South Africa. And hopefully by the end of the year, I do hope to have it available internationally. And I am also currently focusing on publishing more books, because I believe that our activism doesn't only lie lie in the streets demanding for change, and doesn't only lie in decision-making rooms, but also lies in the pages of literature, which ultimately become the education that people receive and the education that socializes people. And I grew up in a time whereby there wasn't adequate representation. And I feel that it is my mission to bring forward representation to the table that is positive and that is empowering and that is powerful and that is going to change the trajectory of the entire world at large. And so I am currently focusing on writing more books. I'm in the process of writing my second book, and among other things, I'm also currently also beginning to find my feet in hoping to found my own foundation, which will focus on racial justice, as well as focus on giving young people a voice and giving young people the platform to talk about racism and talk about race, as well as talk about how to bring about change in their own small corner and their own community.
Oh, that I'm so happy to hear that. We need you, and I can't wait to read your book. I have to get a copy, and your second book. I love that you're studying law and that's your focus, and everything that you've spoken about. I feel like I'm meeting and sitting with truly one of the future leaders in the world. I think you are a force, and you are so gracious and so intelligent, and it is really, really an honor to speak to you.
Thank you very much. It is an absolute honor to speak to you. I cannot begin to put it into words how much of an honor it is to speak to you, because I am truly inspired by your advocacy for human rights.
Well, it is my pleasure, my strong beliefs. So I hope to meet you in person one day.
I hope to meet you in person too. And if possible, I would truly be honored to have a copy of my book, Saint for your daughter.
Oh, please. Yes. She would love that.